Prosody. There's a pattern almost everyone who's dealt with a narcissist eventually notices, usually with a mixture of dread and disbelief. Prosody. No matter how final the ending seemed, no matter how much time has passed. Prosody. No matter how thoroughly you believed this particular chapter was closed, they come back. Not always in the same form. Prosody. Sometimes it's a message that arrives out of nowhere after months of complete silence. Prosody. Sometimes it's a sudden appearance at an event they had no real reason to attend. Sometimes it's something smaller. Prosody. An unexpected like on an old photo, a mutual friend mentioning they've been asking questions about your life. Prosody. But the pattern itself is remarkably consistent. Consistent enough that, by the time it happens for the second or third time. Prosody. Most people stop being surprised by the return itself and start wondering about something more specific: why, and more importantly, when. This is what we're exploring today, and I want to be direct about something from the start. Prosody. Because it changes how useful this information actually becomes. Prosody. Understanding why and when narcissists tend to return isn't about predicting the future with certainty. Prosody. And it isn't about spending your energy braced for an inevitable reappearance. It's about recognizing that these returns aren't random, aren't evidence of genuine, unprompted love finally resurfacing. Prosody. And aren't something you need to fear in the way uncertainty tends to make people fear things. They follow a logic. Prosody. And once you understand that logic clearly, the return itself, whenever it eventually happens, prosody, stops holding the same disorienting power it once did. Let's start with the most fundamental question. Why do they come back at all? Prosody. Especially after periods of complete silence that might have convinced you they'd genuinely moved on for good. Prosody. The answer connects directly to something we've traced throughout this entire series about what narcissistic psychology actually depends on to remain stable. Prosody. Remember what we've established repeatedly: a narcissist's sense of self isn't generated primarily from the inside. It requires ongoing external confirmation, evidence that they still matter, still have impact. Prosody. Still occupy significant space in the minds of people who have passed through their life. Prosody. This need doesn't have an expiration date tied to how much time has passed since the relationship ended. It persists quietly in the background, long after any practical reason for contact has disappeared. This is worth understanding precisely. Prosody. Because it explains something that confuses a lot of people the first time it happens. Why someone who showed no interest in reconciliation, who seemed genuinely to have moved on entirely, suddenly resurfaces years later, often at a moment that seems to have nothing to do with you at all. The return isn't usually triggered by renewed love. Prosody. And it isn't usually triggered by genuine, sustained thought about your well-being during the intervening time. Prosody. It's triggered by something happening in their own internal world. Some disruption to their current sources of validation. Prosody. Some reminder of your existence that reactivates the old, familiar pull toward a source of confirmation that once reliably worked. Prosody. Let's talk about the specific circumstances that tend to trigger this reactivation. Prosody. Because understanding these triggers is what actually answers the when half of this exploration's title. Prosody. The first and most common trigger is a disruption in their current primary source of validation. Typically a new relationship ending, faltering. Prosody. Or simply failing to provide the same intensity of attention and admiration it once did. Prosody. Remember everything we've traced throughout this series about how narcissistic psychology depends on ongoing supply. A continuous source of confirmation that stabilizes an otherwise fragile internal sense of self. When a current source of that supply weakens, prosody, whether through a breakup, growing distance, or simply the natural settling of intensity that happens in any relationship over enough time, prosody, the underlying instability that source was managing doesn't disappear. It searches, often unconsciously, for an alternative source, prosody. And previous partners, especially ones who provided particularly reliable or intense supply during the original relationship, become an obvious, familiar target for that search. This is worth sitting with directly, because it reframes something that might otherwise feel flattering into something considerably more accurate, If a narcissist resurfaces shortly after a new relationship has ended or clearly deteriorated, this timing isn't a coincidence, And it isn't evidence that they finally realized, through comparison, how much you actually meant to them, It's evidence that their current source of supply has become unreliable, and you represent a previously proven, previously reliable alternative, one that requires less risk than pursuing someone entirely new, precisely because you already have a demonstrated history of providing exactly what they're now missing. Let's talk about a second common trigger, one that operates through a slightly different mechanism, significant life transitions that threaten a narcissist's sense of identity or significance. This might include a career setback, an aging milestone that threatens their sense of relevance or attractiveness, a major loss, or any other significant disruption to the stable self-image they typically work hard to maintain. During these transitions, the underlying insecurity, this entire psychological structure exists to manage becomes considerably harder to keep suppressed, and old sources of validation, including people from the past who once reliably provided it, often resurface in memory, and eventually, in actual contact, as part of an unconscious attempt to restore some sense of stability during a period when current sources feel insufficient. This is worth understanding because it explains why returns often cluster around specific, identifiable moments: a milestone birthday, a divorce, a job loss, a period of visible professional or personal struggle, If you notice that a narcissist's reappearance coincides suspiciously with some significant disruption in their own life, this isn't a coincidence either. It's a direct reflection of exactly the mechanism we've been tracing throughout this entire exploration, instability elsewhere in their life, searching for a familiar, previously reliable source of stabilization, regardless of how much time has passed or how thoroughly the original relationship seemed to have ended. Let's introduce a third trigger, one that connects directly to something we've discussed extensively in earlier explorations throughout this series, because it deserves the fuller treatment we'll give it in the next part: evidence, whether direct or secondhand, of your own visible thriving, This trigger operates through a genuinely different mechanism than the first two, and understanding exactly why visible peace and success provoke return in a way that struggle rarely does is exactly where we need to go next, along with a deeper examination of the actual timing patterns that make these returns, however disorienting they feel in the moment, considerably more predictable than they initially appear. Let's go directly into that third trigger, because it operates through a mechanism genuinely different from the first two, and it deserves the careful explanation we set up at the end of part 1: evidence, whether direct or secondhand, of your own visible thriving, We've touched on this pattern in earlier explorations throughout this series, but it's worth revisiting here with specific attention to how it functions as a trigger for return, because understanding this mechanism explains some of the most confusing and painful instances of narcissistic reappearance, the ones that seem to arrive at exactly the moment they should matter least, Here's what's worth understanding precisely about why visible thriving functions this way, Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about what a narcissist's sense of significance actually depends on, not simply being loved or admired in the present moment, but believing they occupy a permanent, essential place in the story of everyone who has ever mattered to them. This belief requires ongoing confirmation, and one of its most threatening potential contradictions is evidence that someone they once dominated, once controlled, once assumed would carry permanent damage from the relationship, has instead built a genuinely full, peaceful, successful life that seems to have nothing to do with them at all. This evidence doesn't produce genuine happiness for you on their part, prosody. It produces something closer to alarm, because it directly threatens the story their entire psychological stability depends on. This is why so many people experience the confusing, prosody, almost eerie pattern of a narcissist resurfacing specifically during periods of visible success or happiness, rather than during periods of struggle, prosody, when you might logically expect them to feel more emboldened to return. A promotion announced publicly, a new relationship that looks genuinely stable, a milestone celebrated with obvious joy. These moments, prosody, which should have nothing to do with someone no longer part of your life, prosody, frequently coincide with unexpected contact, precisely because they represent the exact evidence most threatening to the narrative the narcissist needs to maintain. The return, in these cases, isn't about celebrating your success, prosody. It's an attempt to reinsert themselves into a story that's begun to feel dangerously complete without them, prosody, testing whether their presence can still disrupt something that currently looks too resolved, too peaceful, too thoroughly moved beyond them, prosody. Now let's bring these three triggers together and talk about the actual timing patterns this produces, because understanding this convergence is what actually makes the when in this exploration's title genuinely useful, rather than simply theoretical, prosody. Returns tend to cluster around three overlapping conditions: a disruption in their current source of supply, prosody, a significant transition threatening their own sense of identity or significance, and evidence of your own visible thriving reaching them, whether directly or through mutual connections. When any one of these conditions is present, a return becomes more likely than during periods when none of them apply. When multiple conditions overlap, when a current relationship is failing at the same time they're experiencing some other significant life disruption, and word of your own success or happiness happens to reach them during this same window, the likelihood of contact increases considerably, prosody, and it tends to happen with a timing that can feel, to the person on the receiving end, almost eerily precise. This precision isn't actually mysterious once you understand the underlying mechanism, prosody. And it's worth naming this clearly because it removes something that often adds unnecessary confusion to these situations, prosody. The temptation to interpret perfectly timed contact as evidence of some deeper, almost supernatural connection, prosody. Some sign that they somehow sensed exactly the right moment to reach out, prosody. What's actually happening is considerably more mundane and considerably more explainable: multiple ordinary triggers converging simultaneously, prosody, each one independently increasing the likelihood of contact, producing a combined effect that feels, from the outside, prosody, more calculated or more meaningful than it actually is. Let's talk about something important worth naming directly here, because it addresses a common and understandable confusion. Does this mean every instance of contact after a breakup is calculated and insincere, prosody? The honest answer requires some nuance. Not every reappearance is consciously, deliberately strategic in the way this might make it sound. Often, the narcissist experiencing these internal pressures isn't consciously thinking, "My current relationship is failing, prosody, so I should reach out to someone from my past to restore my sense of stability." The pull toward contact usually feels, subjectively, prosody, like genuine longing, genuine reflection, genuine reconsideration of what was lost. This subjective experience is often real, prosody, even though its underlying cause has little to do with a sudden, spontaneous rediscovery of how much you actually meant to them, prosody, and everything to do with the specific, identifiable triggers we've traced throughout this entire exploration. This distinction matters enormously for how you interpret contact if and when it eventually arrives, prosody. The sincerity of their subjective experience in the moment of reaching out doesn't actually tell you very much about what's driving that experience underneath, prosody. And understanding this separation protects you from a very specific and costly mistake: assuming that, because their longing feels genuine to them, it must therefore represent something stable and trustworthy enough to justify re-engaging. Genuine subjective feeling and reliable, sustainable motivation are not the same thing, prosody. And conflating them is exactly what pulls people back into relationships that predictably repeat the same patterns that necessitated the original ending in the first place. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, prosody. The one where we need to address directly what all of this actually means for how you should respond, practically and emotionally, prosody. When this return eventually arrives, whether it's triggered by a failing new relationship, a significant life transition, prosody, evidence of your own thriving, or some combination of all three converging at once, prosody. And why understanding the mechanics we've traced throughout this entire exploration changes what that return actually represents, and what it doesn't, once it finally, inevitably shows up. Let's talk directly about what this return actually means once it arrives, prosody. Because everything we've traced across this exploration has been building toward a single, practical understanding worth carrying forward, prosody. When contact eventually comes, whether after months of silence or years of it, whether triggered by a failing relationship, prosody, a significant life transition, evidence of your own thriving, or some convergence of all three, the most important thing to understand is this, prosody. The timing tells you almost everything you need to know, and it tells you considerably more than the content of whatever message actually arrives. Here's what this means in practice. If you can trace the return back to any of the three triggers we've discussed, and in most cases, prosody, with a little reflection, you usually can, this information matters far more than whatever the message itself claims to be about, prosody. A message that arrives shortly after their new relationship publicly ended isn't really about you, prosody. However much of your history together it might reference, however sincere it might sound in the moment of reading it, prosody. A message that arrives during an obvious personal crisis, a job loss, a difficult birthday, a period of visible struggle, isn't really about rediscovering what was lost between you, prosody. It's about searching for a familiar source of stability during a moment when their current sources have become insufficient, prosody. A message that arrives suspiciously close to news of your own success or happiness isn't a celebration of that success, prosody. It's an attempt to reinsert themselves into a story that had started to feel too resolved without them, prosody. This is worth understanding as genuinely liberating, because it removes something that tends to complicate these moments unnecessarily. The need to carefully parse the content of the message itself, searching for evidence of sincerity, searching for signs of genuine growth, prosody, searching for some indication that this time might actually be different. The content rarely matters as much as the timing, prosody. And once you've developed the habit of checking the timing first, asking what else is happening in their life right now, prosody, what recent disruption might explain this specific moment rather than any other, the content becomes considerably easier to read accurately, prosody. Stripped of the persuasive power it holds when examined in isolation, disconnected from the broader pattern it actually belongs to, prosody. Let's talk about what this understanding actually changes about how you experience these returns emotionally, prosody. Because this is where the deepest insight of this entire exploration comes into view. Before you understand this mechanism clearly, prosody, each return tends to feel disorienting, almost personal in a way that reopens old uncertainty. Why now? What does this mean, prosody? Could this time actually be genuine? After you understand this mechanism clearly, each return becomes considerably easier to place, prosody. Not because you've become cynical or incapable of believing in anyone's capacity for genuine change, prosody, but because you've developed an accurate framework for distinguishing between contact driven by their own internal instability and contact that might, in rare cases, actually reflect something more substantial and more trustworthy. This distinction matters enormously, prosody, because it would be dishonest to suggest genuine change is categorically impossible. Prosody. And it would be equally dishonest to suggest every single return follows this pattern without exception. What actually determines the difference? Prosody. And this is worth stating clearly as the final, most practical insight this exploration can offer, is what happens after the initial contact, independent of any triggering event. Prosody. Contact driven by the mechanisms we've traced throughout this entire exploration tends to fade in intensity once the underlying trigger resolves itself. Once the new relationship stabilizes again, once the personal crisis passes. Prosody. Once the discomfort produced by news of your thriving settles into something more tolerable. Genuine, sustainable reconsideration. Prosody. On the rare occasions it does happen, tends to persist independent of these triggers, expressed through sustained, consistent behavior over meaningful time. Prosody. Rather than through intensity that arrives suddenly and fades just as quickly once its actual underlying cause resolves itself. Prosody. This is worth carrying forward as the practical core of everything we've traced throughout this entire exploration. You don't need to resolve prosody. In the moment contact arrives, whether this particular instance is genuine or triggered, you simply need to wait. Prosody. Watch for whether the intensity sustains itself independent of whatever life circumstance likely prompted it. Prosody. And let time itself answer a question that no single message, however convincing, is actually capable of answering on its own. This patience isn't coldness, and it isn't punishment. Prosody. It's simply an accurate response to an accurate understanding of how this particular pattern reliably tends to unfold. So if there's one thing worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration, let it be this. They come back. Prosody. Reliably and predictably, not because what you shared was too significant to ever fully release, and not because some part of them has finally, genuinely understood what they lost. Prosody. They come back because their own internal stability depends on sources they haven't learned to generate from within themselves. Prosody. And you represent one of those sources, proven reliable through the actual history you share. Prosody. Regardless of how long ago that history occurred, or how thoroughly you believed it had ended. Prosody. Understanding this doesn't require you to close the door forever if genuine change ever does present itself through sustained prosody, consistent evidence over real time. But it does mean you no longer need to be disoriented by the return itself, whenever it eventually happens. Prosody. Because you'll understand, clearly and accurately, exactly why it's happening, exactly what it likely means, and exactly how much weight, if any, prosody, it actually deserves in a life that was always yours to keep building, whether they ever came back or not.